Chapter 21. A few days after this, the prisoners were honored by another visit from the alcalde. "Thank God!" cried Edric involuntarily as soon as he saw him, for as he felt confident that the anger he had expressed against him had been assumed, he hoped he was now come to save them.
"Alas," returned the worthy magistrate, "I fear you have little reason to be thankful, for my endeavors to save you have only succeeded in obtaining a few hours' respite, and tomorrow morning you are to be condemned to be burnt alive."
"Oh!" shrieked the doctor, whilst even Edric's courage could not prevent his turning deathly pale. "It is dreadful," said he, "to die thus so young in a foreign country, and by such fearful means."
"Shoo! Don't talk about it," sobbed the doctor. "My poor dear Edric! Save him, sir! In mercy, save him! Though I may be doomed to pay for the penalty of my folly, it is very hard he should suffer."
"It is indeed," returned the alcalde, "and my wish to save him, joined by the hatred I bear at the present general, has made me a traitor to my country. I see you look astonished, but to explain what I mean, it will be necessary to give you a short sketch of the present state of this country, which I will endeavor to do in as few words as possible. You know, no doubt, that Spain was once a powerful empire until the ill-judged policy of one of its monarchs, in removing the seat of government to Africa, occasioned her fall. For the tree of majesty becoming too widely extended, it was but natural that some of the branches should strike root for themselves, and detach themselves entirely from the parent stem. This was the case with Spain, and her first directors as a republic happened to be intelligent men. The infant state grew and flourished, exciting the admiration of its neighbors and the envy of its mother country. Unfortunately, however, the wheel of fortune is always spinning, and Spaniards, as I said, not knowing where to stop, have gone on, getting worse and worse by degrees, till they have become the bigoted and intolerant wretches you have found them. In fact, the army now rules the state, and the people, finding the tyranny in the soldiers insupportable, have been for some time attempting to throw off the yoke. They were long unsuccessful, and they found the discipline to the soldiers far outweighed all their bravery and self-devotion. In their distress, however, they called in the aid of Roderick the Second, the young and warlike king of Ireland. This powerful monarch, who realizes himself in all the romantic qualities of the ancient knights of chivalry, hastened instantly to their assistance, and they now are combating under his auspices with every prospect of success. His progress has been magical. Success has followed wherever he has gone, and his army now lies at a little distance, though he landed north of Spain. It is to him, therefore, that I have sent secretly, giving him, in the hope of saving you, instructions, by which, if he follows them, he cannot fail of surprising the camp." The doctor and Edric, though they were fully aware that they were principally indebted to the hatred of the alcalde bore the present general for the steps they had taken on their behalf, yet felt expressed themselves properly grateful. The alcalde quitted the prison, leaving the flatterer Hope behind to console them for his absence, mingled, however, with his natural anxiety, which they could not help feeling, lest the well-arranged plan laid for their escape should fail. Morning had just dawned after a tedious and miserable night, and the doctor and Edric were yet shivering in the cold damp which often precedes the break of day, and which now seemed to have struck a chill to their inmost souls, when the door of the prison was opened and a file of soldiers appeared, ready to conduct them to their place of execution. The doctor's heart beat thick, so as to impede respiration, and the heavy foam spread before his eyes, whilst the agitation of Edric, who had, however, now quite forgiven him, was scarcely inferior to his own. Fervently they embraced, and then submitted to being pinioned. They were forced to march to the spot appointed for their sacrifice, where an eminent crowd awaited their approach. The doctor's heart sunk within him as he looked down from a kind of terrace upon which the ceremony was to take place. Upon the mass of human heads jammed together below, every face regarding him with a gaze of anxious expectation, and as he turned to these eager looks with a thrill of horror, his feelings were not more forcibly harrowed up by the sight behind him. This was composed of two iron stakes fixed firmly in the ground, and provided with ponderous chains as to prevent the remotest possibility of escape, whilst the enormous heaps of green wood piled around each gave a frightful idea of the intensity of the lingering torments the unfortunate prisoners were condemned to suffer. To the mind of Eric, in the meantime, which was not much more composed than that of his friend, he had also looked around, and whilst nature shuddered at the thought of the horrid death awaiting them, the immensity and compactness of the crowd seemed to destroy all probability of a rescue, and the hope which had till then been supported him fled from his breast. Whilst, as his eyes again met those poor doctor, mournful indeed was the glance that they exchanged. It is an awful thing to die, and though there are occasions that death may be braved, or at least met with unabated courage, yet when it comes on thus slowly and deliberately, seen from far off, and yet impossible to be avoided, the firmest mind will find it difficult to bear its approach unmoved. That of Edric, however, notwithstanding it, had been weakened by his long confinement, and by the delusive flattery of hope, did not shrink from the trial, and calmly he even saw the crowd divide to make way for the executioner, who slowly advanced, preceded by a band of martial music, playing a mournful air, the drums being covered with black crape, and followed by a long train of soldiers in mourning cloaks with their arms reversed. Nothing could be more appalling than this lugubrious procession, the executioner, musicians, and soldiers being all shrouded in their gloomy cloaks, the very hoods of which were drawn over their heads, had the air of demons coming to bear away the miserable victims to everlasting perdition, and the mind of the unhappy doctor not being able to endure such accumulated horrors, he sunk upon his knees, uttering shrieks of anguish, whilst the cold sweat ran down in large drops from his forehead, and every nerve quivered with agony. The procession had now nearly reached the prisoners, and even Edric's firmness gave way, as he saw the executioner spring upon the terrace and advance towards him. A convulsive throb of anguish seemed to rend his heart, and his lips and cheeks turned to livid paleness, but how was he surprised with a sudden revulsion of feeling he did not experience, when the supposed executioner, after having unbound his arms, put a sword in his hands, whispering, "Now is the time to defend yourself. Our soldiers are in the green," and left him completely free. Completely overcome, Edric stood for a moment lost in amazement, unable to credit the evidence of his senses, and gazing after his deliverer, who, the moment he had unbound the doctor, threw off his disguise and shouted, "Roderick forever!" disclosed to the multitude below the dreaded form of the Irish hero himself. Shouts of "Roderick forever!" now rent the skies, and the soldiers who had followed their monarch, and several others who had lurked concealed amongst the crowd, threw off their disguises at the same moment, and formed around the leader, whilst the main body of his troops, left behind in the care of the experienced generals, tutored for the purpose, charged with the affrighted Spaniards in the rear. The confusion and dismay that now prevailed were quite beyond description. The terrified Spaniards, who, naturally superstitious, had long fancied the wondrous acts of heroic valor attributed to Roderick could only be performed by magic, were now fully convinced that his sudden appearance amongst them was an act of especial favor from his infernal majesty himself, and finding themselves attacked on all sides, imagined their enemies multiplied by the powers of darkness, and fled without striking a blow. Roderick and his soldiers returned laughing after they had pursued them a little way, to ransack and burn their camp, which when they had done, they retired to their former station, having previously presumed the alcalde to spare the town, and not to push the consequences of their victory farther. The doctor and Edric, who had been too much agitated to take a very active part in the combat, had been conveyed by the guards of Roderick to their master's camp, to await there the return of his monarch, in whose hands destiny had now placed them. Neither of our travellers had noticed the person of the Irish king when in the bustling moment of the deliverance, but almost imaginable serenity with which he had conveyed to disperse enemies, the evident terror with which the very name seemed to inspire the Spaniards, and the wondrous feats of the guards around them seemed to delight in attributing them, made them now almost tremble at the thought of being presented to so tremendous a personage, whom they assumed themselves in picturing as a stern, fearful tyrant, breathing nothing but war and desolation. Roderick the Second, surnamed the Great, was then in the flower of his age. He had not long ascended to his throne, and his father, who had been a prudent prince, having left behind him a well-established government, able statesmen, and a considerable sum in the treasury, Roderick had little to employ his mind at home. Brave, ardent, and enterprising, burning for conquest and spurning the quiet domestic peace, the overtures of the Spaniards had met his most ardent wishes, and he had embraced their cause with an eagerness and impetuosity that had hitherto carried everything before it. The great part of Spain lay at his feet. Even Madrid was his, but it was to attack Seville as the queen of the cities that he was now in Andalusia. The city was still in the power of his enemies, and Roderick, having made Cadiz his headquarters, was about removing there, when the message of El Alcalde had induced to undertake the romantic enterprise that had just so successfully accomplished. Romance was, indeed, the leading feature in Roderick's character. It had been the policy of his father, the late king, to foment secretly the discontents malnourished amongst the Angles, and the spirit that Roderick revolted at the conduct he considered so mean at the base. The Spanish War, on the contrary, exactly suited his disposition to aid an oppressed people, to throw off the yoke of their oppressors, seemed noble and generous, and he engaged in the enterprise with all the energy of his bold and daring temper. The soldiers adored him, and his people warmly seconded his efforts, for as the seat of war was far removed from them, and as the treasurer of the late king defrayed expenses, they felt none of the inconveniences of war, and gloried the triumphs of their sovereign. Thus Roderick's praise was the theme of every tongue. Even the Spaniards worshipped him almost as a god, and their attractive imaginations magnified his exploits, till both friends and foes alike regarded him as a being who had only to will to conquer, and whose prowess it was perfect madness to even struggle to resist. Such a monarch our travelers now anxiously awaited, till the suspense became almost agony. At last the joyful sounds of here he comes, long live the mighty Roderick!" burst upon their ears, and the travelers bent forwards, eagerly expecting, yet dreading to see, a countenance stern and fearful as that of Cheops in his tomb. But how were they astonished to behold that the redoubtable Roderick, only a tall, handsome young man, riding carelessly upon a beautiful Barbary charger, and laughing and talking gaily with his officers when he came along.
"What?" cried the doctor indignantly. "Would you attempt to make me believe that the slight blooming boy is a conqueror? The thing is impossible. It is quite ridiculous to mention it. Those laughing eyes, smooth down-like cheeks, white teeth, they may as well be adapted to a lady's heart, as I am sure they never belonged to a hero."
The king, in the meantime, was equally struck with the doctor, and seeing something particularly honest and simple in this fat, round, oily face, he felt a lively interest in him, an excessive curiosity to know what could possibly have brought the man, apparently so harmless and inoffensive, into the perilous situation. The fine person of Edric, disfigured by the troubles he had undergone, also attracted his attention, and he rode up to his guests to question him as their adventures. The noble bard that carried him paced proudly along, though conscious of a little illustration he bore. Even the doctor was compelled to admit the face and the figure of the rider bespoke firmness, intellect, and dignity. "What crime have you committed against the Spaniards?" asked he, when he approached, addressing himself to the doctor in a full, mellow yet commanding tone. "It must have been the blackest dye, if they are to judge by the enormity of the punishment."
"I am innocent," cried the doctor, "and may it please your majesty, I am quite innocent."
"It will please me very much to find you so," said Roderick, smiling. "But assertion is nothing. What proof have you?"
"My friend here will bear witness in my behalf,"
said the doctor solemnly, not feeling at all pleased with what he thought the king's unreasonable disposition for merriment, whilst, as he stood looking very cross, his red face and bald head steaming with perspiration and anger and vexation, his clothes having been torn to rags, and his hat and wig lost in his late troubles, he struck Roderick as presenting so very whimsical and ridiculous a figure that, after looking at him for a few minutes, the merry monarch burst into a violent and almost convulsive fit of laughter.
"Well," said the doctor, still more gravely, "I am glad your majesty seems so well amused, but for my part I don't see anything at all agreeable or entertaining about being buried alive."
The doctor solemnly looked and lengthened face, and as he made his naive remonstrance, he only increased Roderick's peals of laughter. "I Beg your pardon, sir, he said, addressing Edric, as soon as he was able to speak. I really beg your pardon, but your friend here is so exceedingly amusing that I am really under infinite obligations to him, and know not how I shall ever be able to repay him. It is we who are under obligations to your majesty, for which you can never sufficiently be grateful, said Eric gravely. For he also was not very well pleased at seeing his friend so openly ridiculed, as though he did sometimes take the liberty of smiling at the learned doctor's innocent follies himself. He did not like to see him made the laughing-stock of another. Roderick, however, saw that instantly understood the ill humor of Edric, and as he applauded his motive, he endeavored to divert it by every means in his power, and soon completely succeeded. Few people, indeed, knew so well how to make themselves agreeable as Roderick, and though Edric at first felt indignant that the king should treat him like such a child, as to suppose his displeasure could easily be joked away, yet his feeling insensibly wore off, and soon he thought of Roderick as the most fascinating of human beings. Indeed, that heart must have been hard that could have withstood unmoved the fascination of Roderick when he wished to please. His bright laughing eyes that looked the very color of gladness, his arch smile might have been subdued to melancholy of a stoic, whilst his characteristic had something bewitching in his very failings. He had been all his life the spoiled child of fortune, and though his rashness and impetuosity, his patronage and his caressing manner, his braveness, haughtiness, and obstinacy, his fondness for anything that proved a frolic, and his chivalrous notion to noble and grand enterprises formed a singular mélange. He was, perhaps, more beloved than he would have been if his character had been more perfect, and it was this very inconsistency that made him so completely the idol of his soldiers. "Believe me," he said, addressing Edric, "that it is impossible for me to describe the pleasure I feel of having had it in my power to be of service to you, and though I should have been happy to relieve my fellow creatures in distress, yet I must own I am glad that you are Englishmen. It was a policy of my late father to act as an enemy of England, but I have always been her friend. I am such of nature intended English and Irish for brethren, and I am too sincere a devotee of the goddess to wish, even in the slightest degree, to counteract her designs." "Your sentiments perfectly coincide with mine," said Edric, "and as it has been my fate to live in the habits of intimacy of several years with a very worthy countryman of yours, Father Murphy, confessor of Duke of Cornwall, who was the most intimate friend of my father." "Father Murphy!" interrupted Roderick. "Yes," returned Edric, surprised with the wondered expression of the king. "Is it possible that you can know him?" "The name appeared familiar to me, that was all," replied Roderick, evidently finding it difficult to repress a strong inclination to laugh. Edric looked at him with still increasing astonishment, not being able to discover anything in the slightest degree ridiculous in what he had said. Roderick's disposition to mirth seemed to increase to the exact proportion of Edric's gravity. At length, perceiving he remained silent, Roderick with infinite difficulty contrived to say, "Go on, my dear Montague. I entreat you to go on. Never mind me. It is a strange doubt that has just entered my head." "Mr. Montague!" exclaimed Edric. "I was not aware that your majesty was acquainted with my name. I do not recollect having mentioned it." "Perhaps, however, the doctor did," returned the king, "or the alcalde might have told me, or my servants might have seen it marked on your trunks, on your linen, or—" "Your majesty need not give yourself so much trouble to explain a circumstance in itself perfectly immaterial," replied Edric. "I have no wish to conceal my name, and I only was astonished to find your majesty so well acquainted with it." "Well, well," cried Edric, somewhat impatiently, "the circumstance is, as you say, quite immaterial. Pray go on with what you were saying of Father Murphy." "Simply observing that his excellence has the disposition given me a favourable opinion of your majesty's countrymen." "Which I hope the thoughtlessness of the king will not induce you to change. I trust you have too much good sense, Mr. Montague, to feel offended that you may call my frivolity in my manner. My heart, I hope, is good, though I own even I cannot say much in favour for my head. I am a laughing philosopher, however, a sort of Democritus the Second, and finding it more agreeable to laugh than cry, I generally try to find amusement from everything that happens to fall in my way. We shall soon know each other better, And so now, as doubtless you may wish to repose after the fatigues you have undergone, you will perhaps like to retire to the tent we prepared for you. The doctor and Edric willingly assented and repaired to the new abode, completely puzzled by what seemed to them the extraordinary and inconsistent character of the king. Under this gay, laughing exterior, however, Roderick hid a sound, penetrating mind and a firm, determined spirit, whilst, though no one enjoyed more to ridicule the occasional foibles of his subjects, no one knew better how to check them and bring them back instantly to their proper stations, if they ventured a hair's breadth within the limits he prescribed to them. He had thus the art to make himself feared as well as loved, and to rule his subjects despotically, though he never spoke to them without a smile. Such as I have described him, it may be easily imagined Roderick was not long for winning the affections of his new friends, and he, in turn, was equally delighted with him. The noble, generous, and inquiring spirit of Edric exactly accorded with his own, and the follies of the learned doctor afforded him never-ceasing amusement, whilst Edric, delighted to meet with a companion who could understand and sympathize with his feelings, felt happier than he had been for years, and the learned doctor, proud of being admitted to the intimacy of such a man as Roderick, declared all his troubles were repaid, and that he now considered himself one of the most fortunate of mortals.